We are today with session 29 and we continue with the siege of Jerusalem. We had seen all the build up to the siege of Jerusalem, all the events of the first Jewish revolt, and all this is connected to the prophecy that Jesus had made about the fall of the temple. We continue with where we had left last Sunday. We had come to all the events, especially all the trigger point. Remember, we had said about that governor, how he tried to incite rebellion among the people when we went and we plundered all the treasures of the temple, and that was in fact the main trigger point for the revolt. We come now to the events, the final. Okay, this is the final battle. In fact, the revolt went on for more than 4 years. In fact, into the fifth year it goes. And the final siege of Jerusalem, these are the events that we have come today to the final event, which normally I think it was something between 4 to 5 months it lasted. It was just a little before the Passover, okay, and went on till the month of August. So today we are going to look at the siege of Jerusalem in particular. This 4 to 5 months, how things, things came to such a head that finally the temple had to be burned down by the Romans. This is 70 CE, okay, the summer of 70 CE, more or less during the spring. The slopes of the Judean mountains, it is the spring of 70 CE. Everything seems to be ablaze. Why? Because Titus begins his march with his legions from the coastal plain to Jerusalem. Remember in the last session, we had extensively gone through how Vespasian, in fact, 4 years earlier, he was put in charge by Emperor Nero when the rebellion actually broke out. But he had to go back after around 1.5 to 2 years because of events in Rome, in which we have seen that finally how the Emperor Nero, he committed suicide and died, and that was the year of the three emperors. One after another, everybody claimed to become the emperor, and eventually we see Vespasian, who was at the head of the armies, who was trampling the way he had, crushed Gamla, especially in many places in Galilee and all, and then suddenly he had to go back to Rome because his presence was demanded there. Once Vespasian came back to power as came to power as emperor, he sent his son Titus at the head of the legions, and Titus already was accompanying his father, so he was very much familiar with the Judean countryside and also Jerusalem in particular. So it was not that this was a terrain that was totally, new to him. They mobilized, realizing, the strength of the rebellion and the fierce determination of the Jewish defenders. They realized that they would need to mobilize a huge force, and that is the reason we know that three legions were all mobilized. They were brought in from Syria, from Egypt, and also in Rome, and from different directions. I've shared with you map over here. Jerusalem, this is the place where all the legions were assembling from three different directions. They finally assembled here in Jerusalem under the leadership of Titus. When Titus came, he had his three legions. Normally, a legion consisted of around 6,000 soldiers, and these legionaries, only Roman citizens could become legionaries. Okay, not the other people of other lands who came under the Roman Empire. They could not become legionaries. They could become only auxiliaries. So when we talk about the legions of Rome, these are particularly Roman soldiers, okay, ethnically totally Romans, but they were also assisted by the auxiliaries who were normally drawn from the conquered lands. So there were people who were willing to fight alongside Rome. So even the auxiliaries were there. So it was a force of more than 60,000 people who assembled there, okay, at the foothill of the mountains there in Jerusalem. So this is, I put out this picture for you. Vespasian, we already know, when the rebellion actually broke out in 66, by 67 AD, Vespasian was already there in Judea. and he came from the north, and he was like a juggernaut, sort of came down, eliminating all the rebels, so much so that towns like we have I put out here on the map here, towns like Gamla, Yodifat, this was a place where Josephus was at the head of all the troops there initially. So these were the places as they came with their conquering armies. Vespasian crushed the rebellion, and so people in fear had fled to Jerusalem. But once he went over there, slowly the pressure was taken off. And for almost 4 years, the Judean rebels literally overtook the government in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem high priest was totally neutralized, they were rendered powerless, and we have seen how there was infighting and sort of a civil war that broke out between various factions. And we know that there were at least 6 factions under the control of the rebel armies. So this was the work Vespasian was done. Now Titus carries the campaign forward. These are the pictures of both the emperors, father and son. Eventually, we know Titus also ended up becoming an emperor and died 9 years later, that is in 79 AD. Okay, these tens of thousands of trained missionaries equipped with advanced weapons. When the Romans went invading, when they went conquering and trying, especially in particular, to put down rebellion, they were a force to reckon with, because not only were they trained in the art of warfare and combat, but they were also trained engineers of the first rate. So they could literally put up temporary buildings, siege towers, ramps and all, which were very much essential in order to bring down a rebellious city under control. So here you see these big towers. These are the big siege towers that they would normally carry along with them. So when the Roman army finally reached the city, Titus came with all his legionaries from 3 different directions. Josephus estimates that more than 100,000 people were trapped inside its walls, as it was soon around the Passover of 70 AD that the Roman legions under Titus arrived near the city. It is very strange that though the rebellion had broken out, okay, 3 years earlier, and almost like they knew that Rome would not take all these things lying down. It is only because the circumstances were such in Rome, it prevented to unleash its power. So very well everyone knew that finally the Romans would come to regain what was lost in the revolt. Despite this fact, the Jews from all the diaspora, also called the dispersion, there were various Jewish communities all over, right from Babylon, okay, we had Jews in Alexandria, Cyprus, and the biggest and the most sophisticated and most flourishing community was the one in Rome. So whenever these free pilgrimage festivals were there, the people were drawn in big numbers to Jerusalem. And since it was Passover time, which was supposed to be the most important festival in the Jewish calendar, throngs of people would come to Jerusalem. In fact, scholars today contend that one of the reasons Herod expanded the entire esplanade of the temple and made the temple such a majestic building, one of the reasons was in order to accommodate. They had become a headache, because imagine your city, double the numbers on one particular day, you are expected to host all of them. It used to become a big challenge for the city administration, and that is one of the reasons, in order to accommodate all the people, for them to participate in the liturgy of the temple, Herod had undertaken one of the reasons to expand the temple's plaza. So when Titus came, these people who had come for the Passover, especially people from outside, they would stay there in Jerusalem. There used to be hospices, there used to be hostels in which, people could come and stay. The same way, like many a times, we also go on pilgrimages, we go to the shrine of Balankani and all, and we cannot make the journey back and forth in a day. So most of the time with our families, we take up residence there for a short while as paid guests or whatever. So in the same way, the people also who were here, who had converged to Jerusalem for the Passover, they were all caught and trapped, because they had to close the entire gates of the city. So there was no way out for them. And that is one of the reasons the casualties in the siege afterwards was very, very high. The Romans set up their camps in full view of the city in the hope that the mere sight of their military might on full display would terrorize the people of Jerusalem into submission. So they came with all their fearsome, weapons of war, especially their siege engines. So looking at that, it would strike terror in the hearts of the people. But not so the Jewish rebels. They were very hardcore people who were bent. They were driven by the theology that only God could be their ruler, and these people were foreign usurpers, and that was the reason they were hell bent on seeing that they would free the land of Roman occupation. So they refused to submit. Their force, the Roman force, as I already mentioned, comprised of 3 battle-hardened legions drawn from Rome, Syria, and Egypt, Alexandria. They were armed with catapults, battering rams, siege engines, the fearsome weapons of war that helped them conquer the world from England to Persia. This was not the first revolt that the Romans had to put up with. Prior to this also, any number of revolts they had put down. I mentioned to you last time the revolt in England, in England by Queen Boudica and all her tribes together. How they would just send the armies and crush the rebellion because Rome could not stand a challenge from their conquered people. But conquering Jerusalem was not so easy. It was a daunting challenge for the simple reason that this was a heavily fortified city. The walls of Jerusalem were very famous to be impregnable. The city was surrounded by not one but 3 walls which had a very long history down the ages during the Old Testament times, right from much before even David captured Jerusalem. He had captured it from the Jebusites. The Jebusites were a clan of the Canaanites. They in fact were the ones who first had fortified the city. Then after David, when Solomon put up the temple, he also extended the walls. So the kings of Jerusalem, from Solomon to Hezekiah also had to do that because he had to face a big invasion by the Assyrian armies. This was almost 300-400 years before the first temple was even destroyed. So down the ages, the walls of the temple kept on becoming larger, bigger, and in fact very huge fortifications which became a sort of a big hurdle for conquerors. So conquering Jerusalem was a big challenge for the Romans because their walls were very thick. Not only thick, Herod had fortified the city, the walls of the temple he had fortified to such an extent that today they say that if you go to the from the bottom of this, if you look up, it was almost like as if you are looking at staring at a 21-story building with another almost 165 feet to the ground. So such was the height, of the walls, such imposing walls. So it would definitely be a very difficult thing for the Romans to conquer easily. And in the center of all this was a jewel, that is the Temple Mount, with its own massive walls and towers looming as one of the most formidable fortresses in the world. So coming to Jerusalem, Titus bringing all his legions of nearly 60,000 people, it was not so very easy. And we will see how, so I have just put out a picture over here. The very center, this was the holy place, this is the Holy of Holies. This was a place where the sacrifices at the altar and all took place. So this was a central sanctuary. Look at the height of the central sanctuary. This, of course, Herod could not touch and increase its height because it was as per what was laid down in the book of Leviticus. But the surrounding area was greatly expanded by Herod. And so the walls here, the retaining walls, especially in order to make the plaza very strong and accommodate thousands of people, the retaining walls along with those that were visible from the ground level up, they were very huge and imposing structures. But behind those walls, there was utter chaos. The whole city is surrounded by walls. But the city of Jerusalem during the revolt was under complete siege. Food and water could not enter it, and inside it, all governmental institutions had broken down, because we know the Jewish rebels, okay, they were fighting. We had seen how, like, there was one group that uh, they were in favor that they should submit to the Romans and ask for a truce and, like, put an end to the whole thing. But the Jewish rebels were in no mood to do all that. So there were two factions. There was a peace-loving faction which wanted to make peace with Rome, but the other ones, who were the zealots and especially the Sicari along with them, they were a deadly force, and they had captured and trapped everybody, so nobody dared to question them, because with the same brutality that the Roman soldiers would treat them, with the same brutality, even the Jewish rebels, turned against their own people. They were maintaining temple sacrifice, but outside of the temple, there were all of these rebel armies. There were actually about 6 that were controlling different quarters of the city, and whose commanders were fighting about what to do. So there was no central leadership. There was a complete collapse of law and order. Each of the Jewish rebels, especially Simon of Giora was one of them, John of Gisela was another one. So there were 3 main fellows, Eliseo was another one. Each one was sticking to their own guns, and they had their factions that, called them their masters. So there was total anarchy and fear, and as Josephus tells us, tremendous starvation follows, especially when Titus, makes the decision to surround the whole city of Jerusalem. Inside the city, let us see what was happening. The catastrophe that was foretold by Yohanan ben Zakkai, one of the main big voices of peace. Last Sunday we have seen how this was the man who was instrumental finally. Today Judaism survived, okay? The fall of the temple, when everything was devastated and everything was lost, Rabbinic Judaism survived later on, where the temple, instead of the temple, Torah learning and worship at synagogue came to replace worship at the temple. But all that was because of this man, Yohanan ben Zakkai, whose story in itself, how he escaped, okay, from Jerusalem. He had to pretend literally to be a corpse. And his students, they knew the rebels wouldn't allow them to go. He literally had to, pretend to be a corpse, and that's how he made his escape out of the city. The zealots had begun fighting among themselves to take control of the city, when one band of zealots broke into the territory of another. They would inflict the worst damage they could think of. And what was the damage they would inflict on one another? They would burn the rivals' food supplies. And this was one single most factor which brought about great number of deaths, famine and starvation inside the city. And this is exactly what Titus was wanting, okay? To see that he would literally choke out the city into submission. Josephus reports they set on fire those houses they thought had grain and other provision, and soon they were forced into a retreat with the same thing done to them. It came to pass that almost all the grain in the city was burned, which was sufficient to survive the siege for many years. This intensive siege, which finally lasted only for around 4 to 5 months, they could have easily survived had they not burned down the food stocks of their rival parties. With the food supply decimated, many decided their only hope was to flee Jerusalem, but the zealots believed God wanted the entire nation to confront the Romans as one. So what did they do? They issued an edict that anyone who tried to leave would be considered a traitor and executed. So you see how they turned against their own people. They literally forced the people to remain trapped inside the city. They wouldn't allow anyone to go. It was a scary time for the people in Jerusalem, because most of them were non-zealots. Many tried escaping the city to evade the zealots, but fell into the hands of Roman soldiers, who brutalized them with equal savagery. There is a very famous idiom in the English language, okay, jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So it was like, the plight of the people, they were like caught between the devil and the deep sea. They had really nowhere to go. had they to flee from the temple, hoodwinking the zealots who were, very closely guarding all the city gates, they would still fall in the hands of the Roman mercenaries and soldiers who were keeping constant vigil to see if anybody was coming out. So here, as the siege wore on, the situation inside Jerusalem grew more and more desperate, and Josephus writes, of those who perished by famine, the number was great, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as a shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war began, and the dearest friends fell to fighting one with the other about it. Soon many became so desperate that they were willing to risk death at the hands of the zealots, and so they would creep out through little known doorways of the city and gather weeds outside to eat. But outside the city walls, they risked capture and brutal treatment at the hands of the Roman legionaries. And this is exactly what happens. You know, when we read about in the Jewish history, the fall of the temple, especially the first Jewish revolt, even today it is commemorated on the 29th of August, along with the fall of the first temple. Okay, on the 29th of August, they call it the 9th of that month in which the temple was burned down. And they call this specific, day, it is a day of great mourning, and they refer to these events in their history as Shoah. Shoah means a Holocaust, a burnt offering which is completely like, when you sacrifice a bull or a ram to God is a burnt offering, it has to be burnt down to the ashes. So these events are commemorated in Jewish history as a Shoah, the Holocaust. And we know that during the Second World War, the Holocaust, the number of Jews that were singled out for attack by Hitler wanted to wipe them out. We knew that around 6 million Jews lost their lives in the Second World War. And the events that we are today aware what happened in Nazi Germany and all the conquered countries where Nazi Germany had a hold, we know the horrible atrocities that were committed on the Jewish people. But one of the things what they used to do among the Nazis, they are very famous that they would take the Jews to the gas chambers, and whenever they were lined up to be taken to the gas chambers, they would ask them to, put down their clothes. Literally naked, they had to walk, men, women. It is literally you're stripped of your dignity. So not only their clothes were, heaped up, and the clothes then would be sold, but all the jewels and all whatever they had, and the homes also were ransacked and confiscated of the Jewish people. All the gold and precious jewels and all they had was all melted down and made into biscuits. Till today there's a big controversy, and many of you might know. The bank JP Morgan in America is one of the banks that grew very rich and fat on all this gold that was brought into, the gold of the Jewish people from the Second World War. So what these people used to do, many a times, when these people who were fleeing war situations, they would catch the Nazi soldiers, would disembowel them. You know why? Because always, this is a normal practice in any war. They feel that when people are fleeing, places of conflict, what they will do, they will normally swallow all their precious things and all, with the hope that when they, get back to safer places, they'll be able to defecate and retrieve their valuables. So this is a normal practice which happens in most of the wars, and this happened to a very great extent during the Nazi Holocaust of the 20th century. But let me tell you that this was something that was not only something that was recent. Even during the first Jewish revolt, Josephus actually writes what the Romans used to do when they would capture the people who were fleeing the city. For example, when the people fleeing the city were captured, the mercenaries working for the Roman armies would disembowel them, literally rip apart the stomach of the fleeing person, disembowel them, thinking that they might have swallowed gold or jewels, hoping to recover them after they could defecate later on. This was a known practice on the part of people when fleeing war. So, guessing this might be the case, they eviscerated these captives while still alive. So, this level of cruelty and atrocities, was heaped on the people. The Romans took many of these fleeing men, women, and children and crucified them outside the gates of the city, outside the city walls. Josephus tells us that during the siege, thousands of people were crucified, such that the hills around the city were deforested because trees were chopped down to make crosses on which to crucify them. This was the extent of the suffering of the people. During this time, Jerusalem, therefore, was definitely not a place to be in. And as Josephus writes based on eyewitness accounts, there was a certain woman. This is the most devastating and most horrific detail that he relates in his, in his work, Velum Judaicum, the wars of the Jewish people. He mentions particularly about this woman, which shows that even, the people were so much driven by famine, there was nothing to eat, starving for days together, that some of them even practiced cannibalism. And this particular incident he narrates, there was a certain woman that dwelt beyond the Jordan, having boiled her own child, and having eaten one half of him, and having kept the other half by her concealed. This woman, one like many, came to Jerusalem probably for Passover, but when the Romans surrounded the city, she was caught inside the city walls. The word that God spoke to the children of Israel through Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 53 came to pass. You shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you in the siege of desperate straits, in which your enemy shall distress you. This was a very telling prophecy. It's there in the book of Deuteronomy, which Josephus quotes when, narrates this incident, this sad incident of this woman who cannibalized her own child. And this is one of the curses that is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 28, when the children of God, the children of Israel, refused to obey the voice of God. So here I am going to share with you all, most of the time, okay, in frames. I'm going to share with you how the siege began and finally how it ended. So you can go through it later on also. It will be more like, as if a film will be rolling before your eyes. A temple in flames. The final battle for Jerusalem and the destruction of the second temple. This is in the dark of night. Titus brings up his soldiers from 3 directions to Jerusalem, as we already know. Okay, he assembled here. And how he tries to mount a siege, tries to, attack the city. And then finally he fails. Let us see what happens. The residents of Jerusalem awaken to a sight that makes their blood run cold. Okay? When they saw Titus with all the siege towers and all his entire this of 60,000 legionaries, okay, at the foothill of Jerusalem, they were scared to death because they were already trapped inside. 60,000 Roman soldiers, thirsty for war, surrounded the city from every direction. But the Jewish defenders, now they were united, because all this while they were fighting among themselves for almost 3 to 4 years. But when they see the Roman army, okay, at the base of the temple about to mount a very serious assault on them, they knew the time had come. They knew very well that this would be, this would be the final battle, and they knew very well that probably they would not be able to win it against such a big, mighty Roman army of 6,000 trained soldiers. These men were not trained men. They were not trained in battle, especially the zealots and the Sicarii. They were very good, very adept in guerrilla tactics, which were very good when you were mounting, an ambush on armies that were on the move. But here on the plains and in plain sight of another army, they did not have all the skills that the Roman army had. Yet, they put up a very heroic battle. Let us see what they do. The Jewish defenders were determined to fight and refused to surrender. They were willing to fight for the freedom of Judea to their very last drop of blood. They attacked ferociously before the Romans took up positions. It's not that, it was just like a rebel army. They were also, in the 3 to 4 years, they were anticipating that the Romans would come and unleash their might on them. So definitely some sort of, military preparations were put in by the Judean fighters. And as it is, let us not forget that Jewish history always testifies to the fact that the Judeans, they were people who were, built in for combat. So much so that even in ancient times, the kings and all would hire them as mercenaries because they were very fiercely loyal, and to the end, they were people who would never give up. So a sort of an epitome of bravery. So here, before they must have known they could have, more or less guessed what could be the plans of the Roman. So before they could attack, they mounted a very ferocious attack. They attacked ferociously before the Romans take up their position. And from there, the Titus and all, they wanted to attack from the northern side, because when you look at the city of Jerusalem, and especially at the Temple Mount, the city was impregnable from the east, from the south, and from the west. The only place which was, very easy to access and gain entry inside the city was from the northern side. So they knew that, they would try to enter from the northern side. So before that, the Jewish rebels, they strike them. And look at what they do. It's not that, they just sat down very meekly and allowed the Romans to trample them. No, they put up a very spirited defense in order to save their country. The Jews retreat behind the mighty defenses of the walls of Jerusalem that seemed impregnable. So what they did, they mounted an attack, and then they would run before they could attack them. They would go and get inside the city gates. These walls are Titus's greatest hurdles, these walls of Jerusalem. Okay? They were the biggest one, because as I already shared with you earlier, these were very high towering walls, most of the time very impregnable, very difficult to scale them up and gain entry. Each wall was stronger than the other. Like normally, this is the history of, all the walls. Not one king only built up. Several kings, built up the walls and strengthened them and made them bigger. Even after Herod, it was Herod Agrippa who even, strengthened the fortifications that were broken and made the wall very strong. But he abandoned it midway, fearing that, Emperor Claudius might think that he was planning a revolt. This was much way back between 41 and 44 AD, and we are here now in 70 AD, almost maybe 15 to 20 years. So each of these walls, the third wall, this was the third wall, this was the second wall, there is color coding here, and this was the first wall. The first wall was the strongest of all, and this was the entire. Besides that, even after breaching these walls and coming inside, that was not it. Gaining access to the Temple Mount, this was the main thing, which was called the Temple Mount, with the jewel here, the main temple with the sanctuary here. So even gaining access here itself was, something very inconceivable, very difficult to actually attain. So you can imagine the magnitude and scale of this war that was that the Jews were engaged with the Romans. They bring up siege towers and battering rams to breach the walls. Okay? They would come and sort of strike. You have to watch this in a movie, then you get a very good understanding. If you watch old movies, epic war movies, you will see how the Romans in battle, they would bring down the walls of the cities that they would lay siege to. Here is another one. Okay? These are siege towers. This is the way they would try to climb up. And here the people are all defending from top. They will try to throw, even maybe boiling oil and all that. Pictures there later on in the slides will come to. Archaeological finds testify to the ferocity of the battle, with more than 70 such catapult stones, also called ballistas, and arrowheads found in archaeological digs. Okay, these are the arrowheads, and these are the ballistas or the catapult stones. Each one weighing almost 26 kilos. You imagine when they are hurled, okay, with so much of speed, how the walls will finally be breached. With these huge catapult stones, Titus's soldiers continuously bombarded the Jewish defenders, but they would never give up. Each of this ballista or the catapult stone, archaeologists today have made a deep study with all these archaeological finds, and they say that, up to 26 kilos, 26 kilos is quite a weight to carry, isn't it? A huge stone weighing 26 kg and hurled at a speed of around 60 kilometers per hour can do great damage to a wall. Okay, and so they went on. This is the way the Romans hammered the walls down. When a stone like this crashed into the wall, it was better not to be there. Uh, One of the before the siege of Jerusalem and much before the Jewish revolt actually even broke out, I had shared with you in the previous session, there was one particular prophet, okay, who was going on, go to Jerusalem, go to Jerusalem. Joshua ben Ananias. For 7 years and 5 months, he constantly would roam the alleys of the city, shouting out, go to Jerusalem, go to Jerusalem. He was one of the people, when the siege was in full force, when he was going down the alleys, one of these ballistas came and struck him, and that's how he died during the siege. And that was the end of that prophet. Under heavy artillery cover, the iron rams climbed to the top of the wall and pierced it. The largest battering ram of all was nicknamed Nikon the Victor. All these details we get from the work of Josephus. So, have you seen this battering ram? So, this would be one, they would go and hammer the walls, plus they would, with the catapult stones, with this, they would strike from afar. So, this is the way they would weaken the walls and try to bring them down. The battering ram Nikon was the first to pierce the wall. Okay, and the strongest of the walls was, of course, the first wall, which I have already shared with you. The Roman soldiers burst into the Beth Zaita neighborhood to the north of the city. So they breached, after constant bombarding they made a breach in the wall and they tried to enter there. But the Jewish defenders put up a fierce fight, and see what they do. Besides that, the Antonia fortress also was on the northern side. It was the largest and strongest fortress in Jerusalem, and it was built by Herod to the north of the Temple Mount to control the city. So the tallest towers, 3 main towers, were here in the fortress Antonia. So Titus's strategy was that if he can get access to this fortress, it would be very easy for him to gain entry into the Temple Mount. But he was very wrong. Okay? Titus's plan was well thought out. The moment the Antonia falls, the temple will fall. That was what he thought. But look at what the Jewish rebels do. Okay? But in a daring action, the soldiers of John of Gishala succeeded in digging an underground tunnel. This is the fortress Antonia. Imagine underground, they dug tunnels, underneath the earthen ramps of the fortress Antonia, setting fire to its foundations, and the Roman army was caught unawares. In fact, in this ambush, Titus came very close to almost losing his life. So this was something very daring. So this is the way that these acts of the Judean fighters give you a peep into what spirit they had. Fear was absolutely something that they did not have. So they were so much determined to put up a fight and not go down without fighting to the last man. And what did they do? When they set fire from down, it exploded and the whole tower came toppling down. Their siege rams came toppling down together with the soldiers to the ground. The Romans lost many soldiers in this attack, which was bitter humiliation to Titus and his legions. Something like this happening, it happened also to Vespasian in Gamla when he was trying. It was not so very easy. So he also did, in small skirmishes, he did face this type of humiliating defeat. So here, this was something very shameful to the general. Titus himself escaped by the skin of his teeth. At the same time, Simon Bar Giora attacks the ramp opposite the first wall and sets it on fire. So you see, they were the Jewish defenders of Jerusalem. though they were not a highly disciplined and a trained army, a formidable one like the Roman army, they, in terms of courage and determination, they were unmatched, in fact, better than the Romans. All at once, the Roman attack is halted and the entire Roman army is driven out of the city. So, this was a big victory for the Judean fighters. And imagine if you and me were one of the fighters along with them, this would have definitely boosted our morale. So, the same thing happened to them. But the conditions inside the city will worsen now when Titus starts, surrounding the city and trapping everybody inside. Stunned by the failure, Titus gathers his commanders urgently and decides to change tactics. Remember, Titus was a very great general in the sense of military tactics. He was a very skilled tactician. So, being a very remarkable leader in that in military endeavors, he definitely would not sit down, continuing with the same strategy, because he knew this would not work with them. They would never be able to, breach the walls of Jerusalem and directly bring down the city under their control. So what does he do? If it is not possible to break into the city, he will surround it from without. And so the long siege continues with the city surrounded and trapped with all supplies of food and water cut. And this is the way. In a record time of only 3 weeks, Titus builds a giant siege wall around Jerusalem. In fact, a sort of a choke ring of 7 kilometers long that effectively blocks off all supply lines. So everybody is trapped inside because he builds up a temporary siege wall around just in a matter of 3 days, because the Roman soldiers were very skilled engineers and builders as well. The tension in the city grows, and those who are left with little food eat in secret. The people in Jerusalem were trapped between the Jewish rebels within Jerusalem and the Roman army outside. There was nowhere to go or hide. Josephus estimates that more than 1 million people remained trapped for almost 5 months of the siege, dying mostly of starvation or by capture. Fatigue and starvation quickly weakened the Jewish fighters because no food. They had plenty of courage, but without food and water, how can you sustain yourself? And Titus had put out this choke ring around them, so nothing could come in or go out. They shot flaming arrows through giant stones, even boiling oil over the soldiers beneath. Can you see this? The way they were throwing the oil down on them. But, so there were lots of casualties from both the sides. From the Roman side also, there were big number of Roman soldiers who died. So naturally, the anger, within the Roman army also against the Jewish fighters was just building up, which would finally explode when the temple is put on fire. But the Roman army continued to bombard the city walls with their fearsome siege engines, and the temple service completely ceased from then on. And for the next 3 weeks, the siege intensified until the Temple Mount fell on the 9th of Aub, which is supposed to be somewhere in August. The Roman army finally breached the defenses and entered the Temple Mount in the evening of the 9th of Aub, and they reached the temple precincts. But this was not the end, we will see. But what happened next was mind-blowing and totally inconceivable. When the remaining Jews realized the temple was in real danger of being desecrated, they shook off all feelings of hunger and weakness, and as one people, see, these were people who were sick and dying of famine, but even that could not hold them back. When they saw that the Romans had already breached and entered, the Temple Mount, which was within the precincts of the temple itself, they knew that they would have to fight in order to stop the Romans from desecrating it. They shook off all their feelings of hunger and weakness, and as one people fell headlong in one-to-one combat with the invading Roman soldiers. Thousands of citizens, women, men, elders and youth, everyone who could hold a weapon, they all came marching in. Thousands of citizens, they came in, they joined in the fight, and they refused to go down without a fight. The Romans burst through the temple, killing, stabbing, trampling everyone in their path. A bloodbath ensued. This was very much expected. The blood flowed on the colorful stone floors of the temple. Okay, from the altars there was blood everywhere. A moment before it goes up in flames, Titus gathers his commanders for a final consultation. Okay, the day before, this was on the 9th of Av. Late in the evening, they had already entered the precincts of the temple. It was on the 10th of Av, finally, they would be setting the sanctuary on fire. He brings in all his people. We know this. Okay, Josephus though tries to defend, because we have to remember that he was writing his Jewish history, no doubt, okay, from the perspective of his people and his own perspective also. But since Titus and Vespasian both were his patrons, he would definitely try to mitigate and lessen their guilt. In his works, he mentions that Titus had no intention to set the sanctuary on fire, and it was by mistake that one of the soldiers, enraged with all this, all the killings and the bloodbath that preceded this final fall, he threw a burning torch inside the sanctuary, and that's how the temple was set on fire. But definitely that is not the case. We know this because Tacitus, who was another Roman historian, in passing he does mention that before the temple was actually set on fire, Titus called on his commanders, okay, and he discussed in detail why. Because the Romans, by themselves, Romans were great admirers of any buildings and monuments that had a heritage behind them. And the Jewish temple was one such building in antiquity that was greatly admired not only by the Jewish people but greatly admired in the entire Roman Empire and the world beyond. So definitely to take a decision to bring down such a beautiful temple would they had to be driven by very compelling circumstances, and without Titus giving the green signal and giving the command, definitely nobody would have dared to throw a torch inside the temple. So Josephus, most scholars believe, is not to be believed over there, because he tries to project his patrons in a better light. So here he discusses it and he makes the decision that the temple must go. The anger over the many casualties caused by the Jews and the understanding that as long as the temple stood, the Jews would continue to fight made Titus take the fateful decision to raise the temple. So when we took the decision, there was not a thought that was poured in it. It was not a decision, okay, at the spur of the moment, like Josephus says, somebody just threw a flaming torch. That is definitely not the case. So Titus considered this, okay, he mulled over this, he took his commanders into confidence, and the reason why they took the decision to raise the temple was they knew very well from personal experience what a hard battle they had fought with the Jewish defenders, that they would never give up. So long as the temple would stand, they would continue to fight. And that is the reason they make the decision that the temple must go. And thus on the 10th of Av, the next day, Titus' soldiers set fire to the temple. Okay, this is the picture that I have put out to you. The flames quickly engulfed the temple and spread and approached the entrance to the Holy of Holies. The cries of pain of the Jews rose up to the heavens, as reported by Josephus. Okay, when the temple was, raised up, and definitely, even during the feast of the dedication, they would light up those huge, they had those menorahs. They were gigantic menorahs, those 7-branched candlestands. They would light them, and the light could be seen, since Jerusalem temple was on a mount, that light could be seen from far off. So naturally, when the temple was burnt, okay, and it was burning, you can imagine how the entire mount must have lit up in the darkness, and everybody could see the fires glowing. After 5 years of intense struggle against the strongest empire in the world, the temple that had been the source of inspiration, faith, ethics, and righteousness for the Jewish people and all humanity now went up in flames. As fire engulfed the sacred sanctuary, Josephus tells us a very sad detail. He tells us that the Levitical priest, unable to bear witnessing the ruin, witnessing the temple on fire, They jumped into the fires, immolating themselves, driven by shock and madness, seeing the Holy of Holies blaze. The temple was no more, it was burned to the ground. Jerusalem, weeping and mourning, descends under layers of ash and destruction. In pain, shock, and sorrow, the Jewish prisoners are marched through the streets of Rome during the triumphal march held to honor Titus for the victory. Of course, this takes a lot of months. When they are led to Rome, they take some time. But the pillaging and plundering went on for days together. Whenever a siege would be broken, and the soldiers who were the invading armies, they would gang in, okay, they would conquer whatever city that was sieged, they would begin plundering, and that was, a sort of a right that was given to the soldiers to gather all the loot and plunder for themselves. And before them were the spoils of war from Jerusalem. All the treasures of the temple were plundered and taken over by the conquerors, in particular the golden menorah, famously displayed on the Arch of Titus in Rome. We have seen this earlier also. The famous Arch of Titus displays this, and these are not the only things. I've shared with you many pictures of the temple. Have you seen the doors of the temple, how high and tall they were? They used to be made of bronze, pure bronze, and that was very precious. So not only these things that are seen in on the Arch of Titus, but many other. The temple was very rich. So all the treasures were plundered and looted and carried away by the Roman, so much so that we know history is testament to the fact that with the treasures of the of the Jerusalem temple, Roman Emperor Vespasian, okay, who was the father and the architect of all this victory along with his son, he built the huge Colosseum in Rome, which is considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, the big Colosseum in Rome. It was financed and built with all the wealth that was brought in by the Jewish temple treasures. Put out these pictures, the soldiers engage in loot and plunder. The last of the Jerusalem residents hid in tunnels here, which were dug up in archaeological finds. Suffocating darkness and terrible fear surrounded them. 10th of hour was not the end of everything. Days together, the Romans went about hunting people because people were literally hiding in underground drainage tunnels and all. And we know these facts because Josephus also mentioned in passing, but these are all attested in archaeological finds where these tunnels have been discovered. But the Romans searched for them, found them by breaking through the ceiling of the tunnel and killed all of them. Okay, we know this why? Because in this archaeological finds, a severed arm of a young woman with a spear alongside it was discovered in one of these tunnels, testifying to the horrible fate that she must have met. Can you see her whole arm is over here, okay, alongside the spear. It appears that she too was unable to escape to the rebels' final refuge, either to Herodium or Masada. Not all the Jewish rebels fell into the hands of the Romans in this final battle on the 9th and the 10th of There were some who fled. Okay, they fled. They knew certain secret tunnels and all. Okay, they fled to Herodium and Masada. These were other 2 main fortresses. The fortress palaces that were built by Herod. And from there, they carried out their siege. Finally, we know the siege of Masada. It ended only in 73 AD. This is the Roman coin. For Rome, this was such a stupendous, a tremendous victory for them. They had, crushed rebellions in so many of their provinces all over their empire. But they never prized any victory so much or cherished it so much as the first Jewish revolt when they brought it under control. And to commemorate this victory, we know that they came out with a special coin called Judea Kapta. Can you see this? These coins are still there. Okay, and it shows here Jerusalem weeping and mourning descends under layers of ash and destruction. The same thing here. Okay, they are crying over here. And Judea Kapta means Judea is captive of Rome. This is the Roman gladius found on the tunnel floor. Okay, these are the Roman, maybe some of the Roman soldiers, they also must have died in those tunnels as they were pursuing the fleeing Jerusalemites. So here in one of the finds, they have found this Roman gladius found on the tunnel of the floor. This is a reconstructed picture, but this is the sheet. Okay, this is the way. Okay, it was found. And this is a picture, reconstruction picture. This is the way it must have looked. Nearby were cooking pots, clay lamps, and coins of the revolt with Hebrew words. So when they were hiding in those tunnels and all, they put up there for quite a number of months also probably. Okay, but they were finally ferreted out and they were killed. This I've already shared. I'm sharing it again since I'm putting out all the archaeological finds here. The western wall of the Jerusalem temple, okay, which is the longest, in fact, of the four walls. The shortest was the southern wall, the longest was the western wall. It is the western wall of the Temple Mount which still stands today, and you can still see all the stones, how they were thrown down. And there's one particular house called the Burnt House, where lots of archaeological, artifacts have been found that bear testament to the siege of Jerusalem. And likely they say that Burnt House, I didn't get time to put the picture here, but I will put it when I'm sharing the PDF. But in particular, the Burnt House probably must have belonged to one of the Jerusalem high priesthood families. This is the Arch of Titus which I spoke to you about. Okay, you have to go close to see all these things that are put out over there. This is Vespasian along with the triumphal march that he had honored, okay, in order to honor his son for the victory that he attained. The destruction of the temple wasn't just physical. The spiritual aftershocks would change the face of Judaism forever. And this is what Judaism was coming out of after the destruction of the temple. It was not a good time to be a Jew. It was not a good time to be in Judea. And the Roman Empire, we know how mercilessly it crushed this rebellion. When it finally ended in 70 AD with the burning of the temple, it was not the end of it, because the final act was in 73 AD in Masada, where the Zealots had fled and held out for 3 years, ending with their mass suicide just on the eve of the capture of the fort by Roman General Flavius Silva of the 10th. Again, the 10th legion was one of the legions was involved in the siege of Jerusalem, and in the siege of Masada and its capture also, the same legion was involved. This was considered to be one of the most powerful of the legions of the Roman army. The 10th Legion of Retensis, each of the legions were given names and a particular standard, okay, which the standard bearer would hold. So the siege of Masada is another epic tale. I will share an entire article. Those of you interested, please read through, because it is something that makes very great reading, because it testifies to the spirit of this rebels who would not give up even in the face of death. In all, 930 people died at Masada, and at Masada, when they fled from Jerusalem and took shelter in Herodium and especially in Masada, they were not only the zealot Sicaris, they went there along with their families. So these 930 people who died at Masada, they included, okay, they included the families of the zealots who went there under the leadership. He was a very fierce leader, Eliezer ben Giad. Okay, he was the one who who directed the siege at Masada. Masada was another tale which gave a big headache for the Romans. Each of the zealots killed their own respective families, slitting their throats. Thereafter joined lots to take themselves down to the last man. They preferred suicide rather than surrender and die at the hands of the Roman army. And they did this only on the eve. Okay, they knew the next evening the Roman army, because they could see the siege ranks were going higher and higher, and finally they were able to, within a short span of time, it was a foregone conclusion that they would be able to reach all the fortifications and gain access to the rebel outpost. So here they preferred to commit suicide rather than surrender, okay, at the hands of the Roman army. And we know this because all the skeletons of all these people, they were found by the archaeologists at Masada in the fort there. This act of self-annihilation of the rebels at Masada to this day reverberates through the history of the Jewish people and is hailed and celebrated as an enduring symbolism of defiance and victory over brute might. They are remembered and celebrated as the heroes of Masada. In the final act, the Romans ironically gained nothing but defeat despite their apparent victory. When Silva and his men, they entered, when on the day they entered inside Masada, stony graveyard silence greeted them. And when they realized what had happened and saw the heaps and the piles of all the dead men, women, and children, they were horrified because in this great victory, in this great victory, they really did not get victory. It was only a defeat because finally it was these defenders of Masada who had the final say in the matter. So the Romans, though they were victorious, yet they were defeated because the defenders of Masada would not allow them, to have the final say in this battle. It is thanks to Josephus that we have an eyewitness account of the first Jewish revolt through his great work Bellum Judaicum, the War of the Jews, an account he was commissioned to write. The spelling mistakes, I make the corrections. It was an account that he was commissioned to write by Emperor Vespasian, who became his patron. Josephus not only agonizingly witnessed the events he penned down in a book length of approximately 680 pages, watching the war unravel alongside Titus, his patron, but also made a futile attempt to convince the rebels to surrender. To this day, he goes down in Jewish history as a traitor and a turncoat. So this was the final siege. And with this, we come to the end of the session. The first Jewish revolt, which finally ended, practically speaking, in 73 AD. Jerusalem was totally, completely devastated, ashes everywhere. And the people of Jerusalem, the Judeans, were banned from entering the city. They were not allowed to go there for a big number of years. Only on the 9th of Ab, they were allowed to go and, do some sort of worship over there, but the entire temple was in ruins. And almost 60 to 70 years later, the Jews would again break out into another revolt, and that is the reason for this revolt. We call it the first Jewish revolt. And the second revolt, it broke out, lasted for 3 years from 132 to 135 under the Emperor Hadrian, which is called the Bar Kokhba revolt. But it was not centered around Jerusalem because Jerusalem was not there. But that was a revolt which was purely very messianic, because Kokhba was, by the rabbis, he was proclaimed as the promised Messiah. And when he failed to, that is the time they realized that, messianic hopes they were done with that. And from then on, we see how the scriptures in Judaism also, they come to be solidified. The canon gets closed within 100 years. And then entirely it is Yohanan ben Zakkai at the head of the rabbinic academy. They fled, they went and stayed in a coastal city called Yavne. And from there, the entire Torah was, not only the Torah, the entire Tanakh was, finalized and made into a solidified canon with no more writings that could be included. So this entire Jewish revolt had a very great impact not only on the Jewish people but also on Christianity, which I will be taking the coming session. Where were the Christians when all this was happening, and how did it impact early Christianity, and how it brought about a deep divide between the Christian community who were not yet called Christians. They were still considered to be part of the Jewish community only. That was their own self-identification, because till the temple fell, they always participated in all the rituals of the temple. They always considered themselves to be Jews. It is only after Yavne comes in with Yohanan ben Zakkai and the Hebrew canon gets finalized, the division between the Christian, early Christian community and the Jewish people becomes wide, which we normally call in scholarly circles the parting of the ways.